Thank you very much, Mary, for that lovely introduction, and hello to everybody. Welcome to my second lecture recital on the commissioned works of the Dublin International Piano Competition. This is part of a series of presentations in relation to my doctoral research here at TU Dublin Conservatoire, in which I investigate the processes involved in preparing contemporary piano music for performance by learning and performing all 41 pieces commissioned for the Dublin International Piano Competition to date. In the first lecture recital of the series, I explored the background and context of the competition, gave an introduction to my research, and drew upon a comparative line of inquiry to demonstrate the individual styles of each of the pieces commissioned for the first and second competitions in 1988 and 1991, respectively. Today's lecture recital will focus on the works written for the third and fourth competitions in 1994 and 1997, and will center on two important themes. The first theme is composers' perspectives on style and interpretation, and the second theme is the impact of collaboration between performer and composer on the development of interpretation and performance. The works that are featuring in today's lecture recital are The Silver Apples of the Moon, the Golden Apples of the Sun by John Buckley, From the Crest of a Green Wave by Jane O'Leary, Chorale by Raymond Dean, and The Owl Windarag by Fergus Johnston. And I'm thrilled that all four of the composers are here today. I've had the privilege of discussing each work with its respective composer, and it is a really great honor to have you all here. These discussions took place in the form of semi-structured interviews, each lasting over an hour and covering a broad range of discussion. Topics included their involvement with the Dublin International Piano Competition, style, performances and recordings of the piece, questions I had on the piece from studying it, and my own performance of the piece for the composer, on which I received feedback. I'm really grateful for the generosity that you have all shown me, and it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to have discussed these works with the composers of the pieces. The lecture recital today will be based entirely on these interviews, but I have to mention that it is a really great challenge, impossible really, to capture the full richness of all of the discussions in the time that I had today. Instead, I hope to give a glimpse or a snapshot of composers' perspectives on style and the impact these discussions had and the impact of the feedback I received from them when I played their work on the development of my interpretation and performance of their works. Each piece is going to be discussed in turn in the order that they appear in the Contemporary Music Centre albums in which they were published. After the discussion of one piece, I will perform it before going on to the next piece. I aim to keep the whole presentation just under an hour, so I hope you enjoy it. I'll begin with the piece composed in the 1994 competition by John Buckley, or the Dublin International Piano Competition as it was known at the time. The title of this piece is taken from the poem The Song of Wandering Aengus by W.B. Yeats, the poem's final words being the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Buckley wrote the piece as an abstract concept around its title, the colours, the silver apples and the golden apples from the Yeats poem. When writing the piece, Buckley was, quote, very much thinking of colours and relating register to colour. And it struck me that the colours weren't only silver, but that I was looking for golden colours as well, which is kind of a richer sound, with the silver colours being reflected by the upper register, which is used quite significantly. Speaking of his writing style, Buckley describes his compositional style as rooted in past traditions but aiming for a contemporary freshness. He adds that he looks on the piano as a type of orchestra. Quote, the sonority of the instrument is so varied from the deep low notes to the brittle high notes, and I look on it as an entire landscape of sound, end quote. The Silver Apples of the Moon, the Golden Apples of the Sun is a piece he describes as being quite typical of what he was writing in the 90s. When discussing some of the challenges the performer has to deal with in this piece, Buckley said that, quote, it's the type of music that I often write. This is the level of technical demands that seem to run across almost all of my compositions, end quote. Although he did acknowledge that he viewed the work as a test piece for an international piano competition. He says that this piece is somewhat like a fantasia. It's meant to be free-flowing, with different elements fusing together, and it should be quite expressive. Quote, there should be a sense of growth throughout the piece, In the beginning, the gestures are small scale, like little seeds almost, or kernels that are set and then expanded throughout the piece, end quote. As mentioned, the piece has many technical demands, including virtuosic gestures, complex rhythms and shifting tempi, and layered textures. I would now like to demonstrate some examples of these demands, which I think will also highlight elements of style and influence. The orchestral feel of Buckley's piano writing is apparent in the layering of textures in this piece. For example, in the Adagio Cantabile in bar 28, where there are several different layers of sound. Buckley imagines that, quote, the upper two lines in bar 28 might be played by flutes, piccolos, or oboes, and the bottom line by strings, with the lower notes maybe by double basses. When I'm writing for piano, I imagine that it's almost orchestral. So these different layers, when they're being interpreted by the players, should have different sounds because they're in different registers. There should be a different feeling in them, end quote. Point. In these 15 bars, there are 8 changes of tempo and a variety of rhythmic challenges to navigate. On the slide, it's worth noting that everything with the initials JB beside it comes from feedback I received when I played the piece for John. In bar 58, there is once more the layering, which is clear through the double-stemmed notes. And in bar 65, there is an example of his compositional style being rooted in the past, but yet with a feeling of contemporary freshness, as the Brahms-like gesture is played with a restrained tempo. In the last bar of the page, there is the lamenting passage, which requires spaciousness. Lastly, I'd like to highlight the impact of my discussion of the piece with John on my interpretation of the piece, which is listed on the following slides. These include hearing the layered textures orchestrally, having a deeper understanding of the importance of the role and the color, on the color and the role of color, more refined tempo changes, a more expressive approach, and achieving a sense of growth throughout the piece. Lastly, a flamboyant performance, but as Buckley notes, with flexibility within that. I will now play the whole piece. The next piece is From the Crest of a Green Wave by Jane O'Leary, also written for the 1994 competition. O'Leary similarly finds inspiration from poetry, not so much in terms of influence in the music that she writes, but rather in, quote, finding a resonance, end quote. She says that it's often after she's written the music that she tries to find a poem that expresses the same feelings. O'Leary's piece lends its title from a poem by Brendan Kennedy called A Music, in which he talks about the fragility of music and that while it's there forever, it's not really there, it's intangible. Apart from the fact that this temporal theme resonated with O'Leary and the piece that she wrote, the title From the Crest of a Green Wave has another resonance with her artistic vision, and that is the sea. She aims to capture the depth and constant flowing and movement in this piece as it rushes past you. Quote, maybe it gives you that feeling of a crest of a wave, end quote. In describing the character of the piece, O'Leary referred to the foreword in the Contemporary Music Centre album. Quote, the work goes through a series of episodes, each growing out of common musical material and linked by a fascination with repetition, clusters of notes, and the juxtaposition of sustained notes with notes of short duration. End quote. In our discussion on the parameters imposed by the Dublin International Piano Competition, which stipulated that the works had to be 5 minutes in length and not contain any experimental or extended techniques, O'Leary said that it was a little tricky having a boundary, but that she tends to write short pieces generally and is quite compact in her thinking. Playing on the strings, however, is a favourite thing of hers, but in this instance it had to be written on the keyboard only. She highlighted an awareness that the pianists performing in the competition were trying to make their mark on the world stage and wanted to show off their abilities. So, quote, you don't want to make it too simple. At the same time, they're only going to learn it at the last minute if they have to, so you don't want to make it too complicated, end quote. Something which is at the forefront of O'Leary's consideration is the issue of making the music sound modern. She characterizes the music that she writes as being very specific to the instrument that she is writing for. As a pianist herself, she notes that the piano is largely a percussive instrument, quote, because the strings are struck by hammers and it's a very clear incision. You can't blur the tone in the way you can on a string instrument. But more important to me is the quality of the sound when the string vibrates. It dies away. So every sound you make is going to die away, and some things at different speeds and according to how loud they are. So I'm consciously thinking what sounds are still there after they've been made, and the duration of that resonance is crucial, end quote. One stylistic feature that is particularly present in O'Leary's music and in this piece is the very precise and detailed use of the pedals. On her use of the pedals, she says, quote, I'm very specific with how the right pedal shapes the colours, the blocks of colours as we move through the piece, but also the sostenuto pedal, which only leaves open to resonate the strings which you choose. I've always loved exploring those possibilities of certain notes being held on, either with the fingers or with this middle pedal, and maybe other notes being staccato or short against that, end quote. I'd like to demonstrate an example of the effect of this pedaling. I will play the first 7 bars of this piece, during which both pedals feature. It's worth noting as well that in the first 7 bars, bar 7 has no pedal at all, which O'Leary refers to as, quote, little windows of open space, end quote. Crescendo on a note on the piano. As you play a note on the piano, it dies away. And if you want it to get louder, you've got to keep playing it again. We can see an example of this repeated notes facilitating a crescendo on a single note in bar 79. O'Leary also likes to emphasize a particular note, or a couple of notes through the repetition of the single note. The next excerpt from bar 118 to bar 137 provides an example, and I'd like to quote from my discussion with her. Quote, there's also when there's repeated notes and there's a pedal down, there's the use of accents. So towards the end of the piece, there's a low A flat, kind of sforzando, and the pedal is down for this big, long section. It's kind of a huge build-up of sound, but you're hearing this repetition of this low note over space. It builds up and builds up. So the repetition can be on a single note, or it can be that kind of low A flat spaced out. Lastly, I'd like to highlight the impact of my discussion of the piece with Jane on my interpretation of the piece, which is listed on the following slide. These include having more of a fluid, forward-moving approach, nuances of timing in relation to not having gaps between certain gestures, and in other places staying and listening to a note for a little while. A stricter observation of the pedalling and a clearer understanding of the intended effects regarding blocks of sound and windows of no pedal. Understanding O'Leary's intention with regard to rubato and changes of rhythmic units. Rubato is often forward-thinking, came up in the interview. Understanding the build-up of the A-flats as fundamental to the effectiveness of the climax. I'd like to add that O'Leary suggests that wherever possible, the performer and the composer should work together, and this certainly played a big role in the development of my interpretation of this work. I'd now like to perform the piece. quick sip of water if I may. Eamon, your computer is saying that the battery is running low. I'm just a little concerned about that. Sorry. I'll keep going. I will now discuss the next work, which was written for the 1997 competition, Chorale by Raymond Dean. A pianist himself, Dean regards his piano music as the backbone of his output and central to his approach to composing all types of music. For example, when writing orchestral music, he's writing it at the piano. He commented that when he writes piano music, quote, "You can let fly, and your fingers do a lot of the work for you," end quote. A lot of his early piano music started off as notated improvisations because he improvised a lot. Later on, in pieces such as the chorale, there's less improvisation involved, but it would still play a role. While the main title of the piece is Chorale, there is a subtitle which is After Piece 5. In conversation with him, he does not see this piece as being related to the other 4 after pieces, which were composed some 6 years earlier. While the after pieces have, quote, "that kind of coming after the event, looking back and slightly nostalgic feel," end quote, he notes that this piece does not have those characteristics and suggested that if the piece were to be republished, that the subtitle may be withdrawn. For the chorale, Dean voiced that he did not feel like writing something peaceful and reflective. He describes this piece as being in some ways abrasive, although there are some moments of calm. The piece is made up of a chorale, 14 variations of this chorale, 2 embryonic anticipations of the chorale, and a number of frenetic atonal outbursts. Dean describes the chorale as a manifestation of a concept he refers to as dialectic, a theme central to his work. His approach focuses on juxtaposing contrasting elements, not necessarily to resolve them, but to explore the interplay and negotiation between these opposing forces. This piece embodies that approach, where the chorale is consistently interrupted by frenetic atonal outbursts. Dean compared this approach to the music of Ligeti, who aims to transcend the tonal-atonal dualism. In this piece, the chorale has a vaguely tonal feel to it, starting in A minor, which the interruptions completely shatter. While the chorale has 14 variations in total, each presented in different ways, but in essence always the same, the atonal interventions are always different. According to Dean, this piece is probably the second piece that he wrote that made use of the chorale, of a chorale. Since then, chorales have become central to his work, as he stated that almost everything he's written since is based on some kind of chorale idea. In situating the chorale in his compositional oeuvre, Dean says, quote, "I see it coming in the succession of events that led to that kind of musical thinking. It makes a certain sense within the context of my development as a composer in the late 90s and since then," end quote. As the piece was commissioned specifically for the Dublin International Piano Competition, Dean says that he chose to make it technically demanding. Noting that there are some big stretches in the piece, he comments that generally he doesn't write big problematic stretches, as his own hands don't work that way, but as it was for the competition, he thought he'd write something challenging. And here, this particular one here, that's quite a large stretch between the 2nd and 5th finger. So that's one example. Further examples of deliberate challenges include variation 7, about which he says, quote, "I was wondering, how the hell is one supposed to play that?" End quote. And variation 11 and 12, which he says, quote, "This bit is quite unplayable too," end quote. When I play it in a few minutes, I'll just have to try my best, I think. Speaking of the grace notes in this variation, he says, quote, "The idea of having grace notes that just destroy the tempo completely, there's just no way one can handle them. And I want to see, well then, how does a good pianist actually handle it? It's a challenge," end quote. I'd like to demonstrate a few examples next and discuss some of the things that Dean looks for in a performance of this piece, and highlight the impact of our discussion on my interpretation and the performance of it. The opening needs to use as little pedal as possible, while still sounding legato. Dean commented on this and says not to have things swimming into each other, a minimum of overlap. With regard to the atonal outbursts, Dean says that the interruptions have to be very articulate. They must not be ferocious gestures, he says. The notes have to be heard as the contrasting nature of the way the pitches are used in the atonal outbursts and the way they're used in the chorale is central to the piece. So the outbursts require a minimum of pedal and maximum of clarity throughout. Lastly, I would like to highlight again some of the impact that these discussions had on my interpretation and performance of the piece. This includes a better understanding of the structure, an understanding of the use of pitch in the atonal outbursts, a correction of a misreading of the score where I did not observe the staccato, and the gesture which follows it that needs to be played completely secco or dry, which of course I had thrown down the pedal for. A faster tempo in variation 13, and a more accurate realization of the written out accelerando in bar 100. I would now like to play the piece for you. I will now discuss the final piece of the lecture recital, which is The Owl Window Rag by Fergus Johnston, composed for the 1997 Guardian Dublin International Piano Competition. I'd like to start by sharing the story that Johnston told me about the title of the piece. As mentioned, the piece was composed for the Guardian Dublin International Piano Competition. Well, the first thing to say is that the sponsor of the competition, the Guardian Direct Insurance Company, had an owl as their logo, which you can see there. That's the same owl that is on their logo. The owl, as it appears in the title, therefore refers to the owl logo, whilst also meaning old. Johnston also included an anagram in the title, and I'm wondering if anybody can see it. Guardian. Very good. All the letters are there. Reading the title as The Old Window Rag also brings up an interesting point for Johnston. Quote, piano competitions tend to be very 18th and 19th century oriented, and the idea seemed to be that we'll spice it up a bit with a bit of contemporary music. So basically, they were polishing up their 19th century windows with 20th century music. So I thought, yeah, well, here's an old window rag for you. You can polish your windows. Apart from what, in my opinion, is an extremely clever title, there are also some influences of it in the music. Firstly, time is ragged in the piece, with overlapping layers moving on occasion at different speeds. Secondly, returning to the Guardian Insurance Company once more, with their logo being an owl, it was apt that they had the phone number 282820, which sounded like to-it-to-it-to-woo, which of course was easy for customers to remember because it sounded like an owl. Johnston took this idea and used it for the musical material heard in the opening. To get a little technical for a moment, if the pitch F is taken as 0, and every chromatic note of the scale has a number, then G is 2 and C sharp is 8. So the sequence of notes G, C sharp, G, C sharp, G, F spells out the phone number of the Guardian Direct Insurance Company. When asked if composing for a competition had any impact on his artistic process, Johnston responded, quote, no, I just wanted to make it difficult, end quote. But he added that the parameter of composing a 5-minute long piece was perfect for him, saying, quote, it didn't prevent me from what I was wanting to do, end quote. When describing the character of the opening, Johnston said that it should be, quote, a bit manic. There should be a certain menace to the opening, end quote. Overall, the character is, quote, choppy and in your face, but with a nostalgic bluesy bit in the middle, end quote. Johnston described the mood of the middle section as being reserved initially, but becoming lush as it unfolds. He used words such as smoky, jazzy, bluesy, like being in a cigar lounge, to convey a vivid sense of the style. I'll play a bit of that for you now. As I mentioned a moment ago, time is ragged in this piece, and I'd like to demonstrate a couple of examples of this. Firstly, after the introduction, the left hand is heard on its own, with some punchy accents outlining the rhythmic groupings. When the right hand comes in at bar 13, the two hands operate independently, with the left hand initially in groups of 4s, while the right hand is in groups of 3s, thereby making the time ragged. In that example, the hands were dealing with different rhythmic groupings, because of where the accents were placed, but I was always dealing with semiquaver note values. In the next example, the hands only line up twice in the bar, with there being 10 notes in the left hand and 16 notes in the right hand, across the bar. This layering of speeds results in an even more ragged feel to the music. Lastly, I would like to highlight some of the impact that the conversation with Fergus has had on my interpretation of the piece. This includes more clarity in the cascading run in bar 22 actually, to play the fortissimo in bar 29 stronger and not to hold back on it. A cleaner transition from bar 32 to bar 33, an even more laid back middle section. And a quieter start to bar 64, so then I can do a bigger increase in volume, a bigger crescendo into bar 69. I'd now like to play the piece for you. Thank you very much. In order to conclude, I'd like to bring the lecture recital back full circle to the title of the series and speak a little bit about the performer's perspective. I'd like to say that it has been a huge honor and privilege to have each of the composers participate in my research and have such rich discussions on their work. It was particularly valuable to me as a performer to play the pieces for you and to have received feedback on it. It was in my interview with Jane O'Leary that the importance of collaboration between composer and performer became a central topic in our discussion. She said that she views notation as an ever-increasing barrier to interpretation and, importantly, communication, as that is at the heart of what music is about. It made me think about how wonderful it would be to have, a direct phone line to Chopin or Beethoven and, ask them, what do you mean by this marking in bar 32? And I'm really grateful to have actually had that with each of these composers. I believe this has quite strong implications as to the role of a collaboration in the performance of contemporary music. In my process of preparing for performance, I start out with the score in front of me, perhaps a foreword that I study, and I set off exploring the piece and forming an interpretation. In my discussions with composers, I was able to receive insight into the styles and compositional processes, and I learned a great deal about the people behind the music, which has been very valuable to me as a performer and interpreter of contemporary music. I'd like to end by thanking all of you for attending here the lecture recital today, and I look forward to presenting the next of the series to you, in which I will focus on my own preparation for performance. My journey continues into the 21st century as I study the commissioned works written for the Dublin International Piano Competition from 2000 and onwards.